to move to a topic that a lot of people really enjoy and a topic that frustrates a lot of developers, and that is CSS. Unlike HTML, which is rather straightforward, and Python or JavaScript or Java, which are all pretty logical, CSS can be challenging even if you know what you're doing with it. Some people really just understand CSS and it just works for them and the rules and everything just makes sense. Other people struggle with CSS quite a bit. I will say that there won't be a lot of grading on CSS in this class. There will probably be a few quiz questions, but overall, this will be a pretty straightforward introduction. And I think CSS is one of those things that you can use it as much as you need to. So, Cascading Style Sheets. That's CSS. Basically, CSS is used for the formatting of your page. You have selectors and you have declarations. And selectors are basically what are we going to apply this particular style to. And we can base this on elements, IDs, or classes. So elements, like any HTML element, we can style that in a particular way. We can also style elements that have a specific ID in a very particular way. And then we can also create classes that can be adopted by multiple types of elements. And you can actually combine these. So we could have an element with a class, so that class only applies to elements of a particular type, and so on and so on. You can also share selectors using commas, so multiple elements could be formatted the same way. And we'll get into some examples in the next video, showing off each one of these options. So selectors look like this. We have an element selector, a class selector, and an ID selector all on this page. So the element selector will find or match any footer element in your HTML, and it will apply this particular style. So here we can see font style is one of our attributes, and we're going to set that to italic. So that font will be 8-point size, and it will be in italics. We have a class selector that will set anything that we set a class attribute on the HTML element. So we would say class equals blue section, no period. The period actually identifies that it's a class, but when we use this in practice, we would use class equals blue section. And that will set the background color to dark blue and the color to white. You can also use hex codes like you see here. With an ID selector, this is going to match or apply to any element that has an ID set to highlight. Again, the pound sign or octothorpe is only used for identifying that this is an ID selector. Any ID, ID equals highlight. This will then be this border color. And FF, this is RGB, so FF would be red, no blue, no green, no blue. So this would be a pure red color. So selectors can be combined, like if you have a, p, div, then all your anchor tags, all your paragraph tags, all your div tags would have those same CSS properties. If you had p.blue, then how that would actually work is any paragraph element that has class equals blue would then be applied. This particular CSS style would be applied. And then you can also say, you can kind of identify this parent-child relationship. So if you had a header element that was enclosed within a div element, this would apply. So if we were to write a div element into our HTML, and then inside of that div element there was a header element, then this would be matched and those CSS styles would apply to that. Now, CSS styles, in my experience, the best thing you can do here is keep it simple. So like trying to apply CSS properties to lots and lots of things can be pretty effective. I like to use classes and IDs a lot in my CSS. I find that when you start to create a lot of these hierarchies or you try to create all of these relationships, what you end up doing is accidentally applying CSS styles. And CSS styles are additive. It's not like you apply one CSS style, then you apply a new CSS style, and those are mutually exclusive. It will be, there will be some resolution there, and they will be combined. So I find that using classes, sometimes using elements with classes, but mostly using classes and IDs. It's just my own personal style for how I like to apply CSS. You may find it very different. Like I said, everybody kind of reacts to CSS a little bit differently and approaches it a little bit differently. So when we apply our CSS, we can use this, we can create a file. Typically that would be called style.css, though some people call it different things. We can use it externally in a CSS file. That's probably your best practice. That keeps all of your styling in one place. But you can also put them directly into style elements in your HTML file. So you can create a style element, usually in the head element in your HTML file, and you can start defining styles right in that. You can also use the style attribute in an element. Any element has a style attribute, and then you can set CSS properties right there. That is probably not the best way to go about it. Again, like, it's good to separate all of your CSS code into a single place or into, you know, its own sort of concern. So we like to we like to keep the CSS in a CSS file, or at least in the head. Sometimes you can make an argument that you want to have everything in one page, you know, so that you can put all of your JavaScript and all of your HTML and all of your CSS in one page, just to make it simpler to manage. There is sometimes an argument to do that, but generally speaking, for most applications, it's better to use an external CSS file. Not only does that help with sort of separating the CSS into its own space, but it also makes your pages easier to load. As you move from page to page, that CSS file can be cached, and then you don't have to reload that every single time you access a new page. So it saves you a little bit of bandwidth, a little bit of loading. So here is how these are actually used. In your head element, if you want an external style sheet, you use the link element. It's not, you know, the terminology doesn't always make sense. It doesn't always follow logically, but you use the link element with rel attribute set to style sheet. I believe this is relation or related, or I actually don't know for sure, but rel equals style sheet. href, just like with the anchor tag, href equals style.css. So if you leave off the style sheet part, most browsers most of the time are going to be able to render this fine. I've actually never really encountered a place where I need it, but it's one of those things that people just get used to doing, so it's probably a good practice. But if you just have link href style CSS, then that will load your CSS file. You can also use a style element, and you can kind of see that here. When we use the style element, we can just enclose CSS right in that style element, and that will work just fine. And then we also have style attributes. So again, you know, not the best practice. I think probably this is the better way to go about it, but you can set styles individually on elements, and you know, you can definitely be sure that they will be applied to that particular element at that point. You know, that's probably the surest way to make sure that things are working. But you know, you're going to have CSS scattered all throughout your HTML, and that's not always an easy way to kind of troubleshoot problems. So there you can see the different ways we can apply CSS. Now, there are a lot of properties that you can change. One of them is font family. Now, when you use fonts, you usually want to start off with something very basic, or you want to start off with something specific. So like, you might want to try a font that is not very easily accessed, you know, something that might be a little bit more exotic, or something that's, you know, not one of these 5 basic fonts. But it's generally a good idea to have a comma separated list of font families. And one of the ends should be, you know, one on the end should be one of these 5 fonts, so that even if there's a basic browser, you know, somebody's using this like with the Lynx browser or something, it can still resolve that font, even if that font is not able to be loaded. Fonts are a weird thing. You know, I think that fonts are something we kind of take for granted, and there are about a dozen fonts that are pretty commonplace across OSs, across browsers. But if you specify a font that's not loaded or not available on the user's machine, you know, you might have unpredictable results on what actually does get loaded. So generally good to include at least one of these 5 basic fonts. These aren't, you know, these are up to the browser to resolve what fonts actually use, but it will say, you know, it will give you the chance to kind of set a serif or sans serif font. Font style, normal or italic. Font weight, normal or bold. And then font size. There are a couple of different ways you can set font size. You know, back in the early days of the internet, we used points a lot. You know, PT, but I think that you see a lot more EM or percentage or VW or VH. Basically, PX will set pixels, which is nice, but when you get into different browser sizes, different formats, different views, sometimes EM or VW or VH can be more effective, so that you know what you can kind of operate based on relative to the device that you're actually displaying these on. Now, we also have link CSS properties. So and you know, these are actually states that you can set. So like, we can have a link and a visited, a active, a hover. So when we have a link, basically that's just the normal default status. But if we want to do something special, like maybe we want to have links underlined, but we want the underline to go away when we hover over them, you would set a link, text decoration is underlined, and then on hover you would say a hover, text decoration none. So you can get pretty interesting in sort of browser interactivity based on some of these link states. Link and hover. Hover can work on a couple of different elements, but you could also use active and visited to see, when things are actually visited or when you're actually clicking on a link, how their format is different. Now, you also have several different color options. You have color, you have background color, you have border color. There are probably a few others that I didn't include here. Font color, for example. You can use hex codes, RGB values, or some of the basic color names. Hex codes are a 6-digit hexadecimal number representing red, green, blue, and green. I think it's RGB. Maybe it's RBG. No, this is... RGB, yeah. So basically, this is red, this is no blue, and then some green. So this is, using hexadecimal colors. This is a pretty common way to specify colors. So you'll see a lot of these hex codes, and you can specify quite a few colors using this approach. But you can also use color names. Sometimes it's easier to use color names, and there are a lot of them that you can use. There's a pretty large number. Named colors sometimes can be a little bit more easy to interpret, so like if you want to use any of these are all color names that are valid in CSS or HTML5. So you get like dark salmon, you get medium purple, you get I think there's light salmon. So there's a lot of different options here. You can also set background images. We loved background images in the early days of the internet. You don't see them so frequently anymore unless, you're using all sorts of other backgrounds to kind of just put something that's readable or, make your text readable. But background image is possible, so you can use URL to kind of load that particular background image. And then you can repeat that across your pages. Now, everything in CS, or not everything, but many things in CSS sort of operate on this box approach, and this is an important thing to understand. You have your content, so if you had like a div element, you would have content in that div element. You'd have padding that is essentially what's between the content and your border. Your border is what's drawn around it, and then your margin, which is what the empty space that separates this element from others. So you can set border, border style, border color, and border radius if you want rounded corners on your border. But margin and padding would typically be set in either pixels or points or EM or any of those other options. So this way you can kind of control how, not only what your content looks like, but any borders around it and how it's spaced from everything else. And if you think about things in these terms, CSS becomes a little bit simpler because now you can kind of control when either your margin or your padding as necessary to provide the right separation between elements. Within borders, you have a lot of things you can do to borders in CSS. You can set them to be dotted, you can set them to be dashed, a whole lot of different options for borders. You can set a color, you can set the width. Again, you can use all sorts of different options for how that's set. And you can set border left, border right, border top, border bottom. So that way you can set specific borders for your sides or for top. You also have thick, medium, and thin if you don't want to, if you want to let the browser interpret what those borders should look like. You also have block elements in CSS. So basically, all block elements start a new line and take up 100% width by default. So like div elements, for example, they take up 100% of the space that they can. There are also inline elements like span. They just come in normal text flow. But you can change this. You can manipulate these properties with display, the display property in CSS. None, inline, block, or flex. None hides the element completely. And you can also change you can have it hidden essentially or visible using the visibility property. So if you want to hide something but you want it to still take up its space, visibility is how you would do that. If you want it to disappear completely, display none would be how you do that. And when we get into JavaScript, you'll see how we can manipulate these properties to change the appearance dynamically on our page. CSS Flex, this allows you to create containers that will be a little bit more responsive in the way that your HTML is presented. So you can set Flex to be either columns or rows, and this will allow you to lay out elements in the column or row appropriately, and you can use Flex Wrap, justify content. We'll get into some examples later on this. And then visibility and positioning, you can set position to be static or relative. You can also set the position to be absolute, and then you'll need to set the top and left properties for your CSS so that you can specify how many pixels from the top and how many pixels from the left, or what percentage from the top and what percentage from the left those elements should show up. So if you need to specifically position things, you can use absolute position in your CSS. Couple of other CSS properties you might encounter: outline, text align. Aligning things can often be challenging, but you can use text align to align the content within an element. You can use text decoration. You can set the opacity of a particular element from anywhere from 0% up to 100%, 0 to 1.0. You can use text transform to change the formatting of your text. You can change the style of lists, so that you can use different bullets for your list types. So lots of different things that you can do in your CSS here to kind of manipulate the behavior and the display of your HTML. So we're going to take a look at these examples in this next video. They'll illustrate some of the things that we've done before. Some of those semantic elements in HTML, we can use styles to make them a little bit more visually interesting and distinguished from each other. So we'll get into that in the next video. For now, thanks for watching.